By contrast, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against such things. And those who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live by the Spirit, let us also be guided by the Spirit.
For the last 3 weeks, I've encouraged us to remember to live in God's bigger picture, especially during this election. I've advised us to live with longer memories that remind us of what came before American exceptionalism, to live with stronger binoculars, visions of the future that transcend our petty nationalisms. Now, I hope that it's self-evident that what we remember and what we believe about the future and past can fundamentally alter how we live in the present. But I also won't blame you if you're still walking away from those messages thinking, but what does this mean for me in this moment? If you thought, okay, Peter, I've looked all the way back and all the way forward to what you're talking about, but how am I supposed to live in the here and now? What do I do with the particular challenges of this moment while also living in God's bigger picture? So that's what we're going to turn to this Sunday and next. We're going to turn towards the challenge of this moment, and we're going to ask what it means to faithfully act right now as ones who live in God's bigger picture. And to expose part of the challenge we're currently facing, I'm going to begin with a familiar story with a very unfamiliar twist. It's a story of the tortoise and the hare. You know the one. A tortoise and a hare decide to have a race. Everyone believes the hare will win, and indeed, the hare sprints out to a huge lead. But the hare gets cocky and takes a nap, and meanwhile, the tortoise sticks with it, stays humble, plugs along, and wins. Slow and steady wins the race. Now, maybe you haven't thought about that story since you were a kid, but it happens to be a story I'll soon be teaching to my kindergarten class of 1, so it's on my mind. And it reminds me of a short story by B.J. Novak. You might better know him as Ryan from The Office, who picks up the story well after the race is over. The story he wrote goes like this. In the aftermath of a humiliation on an unprecedented scale, a loss to a tortoise in a foot race so staggering that, his tormentors teased, it would not only live on in the record books, but would transcend sport itself and be taught to children around the world in textbooks and bedtime stories for centuries, that hundreds of years from now, children who had never heard of a tortoise would learn that it was basically a fancy type of turtle from hearing about this very race. The hare retreated, understandably, into a substantial period of depression and self-doubt. The hare gained weight, then lost weight, turned to religion, then another less specific religion. The hare got into yoga, shut himself indoors on a self-imposed program to read all the world's great novels, then traveled the world, then did some volunteer work. Everything helped a little at first, but nothing really helped. After a while, the hare realized what the simplest part of him had known from the beginning. He was going to have to rematch the tortoise. So the hare sent a challenge to the tortoise. No, he immediately heard back from the tortoise's spokesperson. The tortoise prefers to focus on the future, not relive the past. The tortoise is focused full-time on inspiring a new generation with the lessons of dedication and persistence through his popular speaking tours and his charitable work with the slow and steady foundation. Okay, now I don't have time to read you all of Novak's story, so I'll summarize from here a bit. Next, the hare, perhaps having learned something from his loss, is persistent, and the tortoise is finally cornered into a rematch after all. So the race day arrives. The starter's pistol for the rematch goes off, and, well, I'll go back to quoting the story here, but kind of. I'll quote the story on this part, but full disclosure, I've really cleaned up the language. The starter pistols goes off, the race begins, and To go back to reading straight from the story, never in the history of competition, athletic or otherwise, human or otherwise, mythical or otherwise, has anyone ever kicked anyone's sorry behind by the order of magnitude that the hare kicked the sorry behind of that lousy, stinking turtle that afternoon. Slow and steady wins the race, Novak concludes, till truth and talents claim their prize. Now, I don't think of this story for this morning because I'm planning to swap it out for the original in Ollie's kindergarten curriculum. I tell you this story because I think it reveals a fear about reality that many of us are wrestling with right now. See, we're in this moment in history, living with a promise from Jesus that says, steady faith in peace and love wins the race. Steady faith in nonviolence wins the race. Stay steady and trust in love and nonviolence, because even if they only seem to work slowly, they will win the race. But then, if we're honest, lately, sure hasn't felt much like that, has it? Felt more than a little like the bullying and bragging politician wins the race, hasn't it? It's felt more than a little like the ones holding the tear gas and the tasers win the race, doesn't it? It's felt more than a little like the ones who flood social media with messages of aggressive misinformation are winning the race, doesn't it? You know, a few weeks back, I read an interview with an influential protester in Portland. She talked about the faith she had in nonviolence when the protests began. In particular, she talked about the way she had patrolled her section of the Portland protests, confronting any fellow protester who so much as threw a water bottle in the direction of the police, pointing them instead to the power of nonviolent protest. But then, she said, she started noticing something. She noticed that no matter how peaceful the protesters were, no matter how much they self-monitored one another and stopped these little jabs of aggression, they too still got pepper sprayed. They still got descended on with shields. They still were beaten with batons. They still were arbitrarily arrested. So she said something along the lines of, I guess my view has changed. I no longer worry about whether or not our protesters are totally nonviolent. I mean, it doesn't seem to matter. They beat us down either way, so maybe I'm seeing that more aggressive resistance is actually justified. Now, this is just one interview. I don't tell you this story to reinforce the myth that all Portland protesters have turned into violent rioters. I don't tell you this story to justify her shift in perspective either. I tell you this story because if we're honest, I think many of us recognize that in our heart of hearts, we're wrestling with some version of her question too. When those using aggression, bullying, and violence just seem to keep winning again and again, when those using peaceful and nonviolent resistance seem to just keep getting trampled again and again, when no matter how carefully and politely and lovingly you try to clarify fact from fiction for an old friend, only to be dismissed or mocked or condemned again and again, does it not start to feel like maybe we've been wrong about the power of love and nonviolence? Does it not start to feel a little like maybe the nonviolent protesting we used in the past doesn't really work anymore? Does it not start to feel like history is now proving that the success of past nonviolent protests were the exception, not the rule? Does it not start to feel like maybe we have been finding too much inspiration in that old original story of the tortoise and the hare, trusting that nonviolence slowly and steadily wins the race, while in actuality, in our heart of hearts, we feel like we're learning to know that the hare would actually win every other rematch, that it is violent power that is winning the rematch between nonviolence and violence right now. But you know, if we look back at history more closely, there is also this, that in the midst of those nonviolent battles we now easily see as so easily won, there were so many reasons for those engaged in them to give up on their principles too. And they too, in the face of so much violence, opposition, and grief, also had to cling to the seemingly ridiculous belief that even when the powers of the world seemed to have an insurmountable lead, if they kept going slowly and steadily, they would still win this race. 250 Common Era was a very bad year for believing that Jesus' way of love and nonviolence would win. You see, in that year, Emperor Decius demanded that every Christian perform a sacrifice to the Roman gods in order to swear their ultimate allegiance to him. When Christians refused in protest, they were simply arrested and executed, sometimes just left to die in prison. In fact, their highest leader, Pope Fabian, was himself executed, as were the other major church leaders in Antioch and Jerusalem. A guy named Origen, perhaps the most famous Christian writer and thinker of the time, was arrested and brutally tortured that year. He would die slowly from those injuries over the following 4 years. And while 250, by the way, was an unusually bad year for the early Christians, it wasn't actually all that unusual. It was just yet another wave of brutal persecution at the hands of the powerful Roman Empire. On top of all that, in the 250s Common Era, many Christians and their neighbors had been suffering through a brutal epidemic, too. The world seemed out of control, writes the church historian Alan Kreider, whose work I'm drawing on here. Some Christians were disheartened, Kreider also writes, and others, having received violent treatment by their non-Christian neighbors, wanted revenge. So in the midst and aftermath of all of that, a church leader named Cyprian found himself leading the church, virtually by himself now. Remember, so many of his co-leaders had been killed. And Cyprian had to figure out what to say to his broken, hurting, vulnerable, angry church. What did he say? It would be understandable if he said, okay, fine. Yes, it's time to fight fire with fire. It would be understandable if he said, okay, I'm getting it now. Jesus may have won against the imperial powers without violence, but we're not Jesus. That must have been a one-time thing, not a model for us to follow. Would have been understandable if he said, okay, enough is enough. We've paid the price of this nonviolent approach for far too long. We've been paying for generations. Clearly, this approach has failed. It'd be understandable if he said, I've run out of patience with this. But instead, Cyprian wrote a treatise entitled On the Good of Patience, in which he writes, as servants and worshipers of God, let us show by spiritual homage the patience that we learn from the heavenly teachings, for that virtue we have in common with God. Here's the thing. Cyprian was far from alone in telling the church to trust patiently in Jesus' way in the midst of brutal persecution. Origen, who I just mentioned, taught patience. Clement taught patience. Justin the martyr, who, you guessed it, was killed for his faith, taught that, counterintuitive as it seems, it would be Christians' patient confidence in living like Jesus that would attract others to them and grow their movement. In their own way, time and again, the early church leaders taught their fellow church members to trust that living like Jesus was not in vain. Even if they couldn't see the results, this way of living, far more than any preaching or talking even, this would be their ultimate testimony. Beloved, Cyprian wrote, we are philosophers not in words but in deeds. We do not speak great things, but we live them. What was the hallmark of that living? Well, it was right there in the title of the book. It was in the good of patience. It was in living the right way, even when you couldn't see that it was working. It was in having a truly ridiculous, by the world's standards at least, a truly ridiculous amount of patience, believing that just as Jesus' love and nonviolence won in the end, theirs would too. It was in believing that just like good wine will spoil if its makers demand immediate results, living like Jesus requires the patience that allows for fermentation. So today, we can ask, were they right or were they fools? At a time when love and nonviolence once again seem to be failing us, it's a natural thing to ask. Does exercising superhuman amounts of patience in nonviolent protest actually work? The truth, of course, is that we can't fully prove that it does. Trusting in the ferment of nonviolence is an act of faith. The truth, of course, is that we can't fully prove it. But we do still have this to give us a little taste of what might be in store. We have the fact that Jesus' message itself should never have gotten this far. We have the fact that the powers of empire tried especially hard when the church was especially small and vulnerable to wipe this way of justice and peace off the face of the earth. We have the fact that somehow, as the early Christians continued to trust in love and patient ferment, the church, as Justin the Martyr predicted, only grew because of its patience. We have, along with so many other stories like that, testimonies that show us that even when those living in the moment can't see that their patient commitment is paying off, it does. You know, there's one last thing I didn't tell you about BJ Novak's story about the rematch of the tortoise and the hare. Novak includes this, that sadly, for the hare, it's only the very, very few who had never heard of his first race with the tortoise who really even cared about that rematch. No matter how badly the hare beat the tortoise in that rematch, no matter how often the hare might beat the tortoise in any subsequent rematches, it was really only the original story that was ever going to be remembered for generations. Just to say, although the rematch momentarily made it seem like the hare had turned the tables and won, in the court of popular opinion, the winner would always be the slow and steady tortoise. It's a great similarity in that to being a Christian, and there's a great difference, too. Similarity is this. As Christians, we too can trust that no matter how often the strong men of the world seem to have forced a rematch with nonviolence and won it, it's our story that's already won. But the great difference is this. Unlike Novak's story, in our case, the proof isn't just rooted in popular opinion or selective memory. It's rooted in a God who came down to earth to show solidarity with the oppressed and thereby to face the world's violence, to refuse to respond in kind, accepting even death, but only so that a resurrection could occur. A miracle so great, so unsurpassable, so definitive, so conclusive that no rematch is even possible. Friends, trusting in the way of Jesus in the here and now truly takes incredible faith in the power of patient ferment. But take hope. In the bigger picture, we have already seen it bear fruit. Our very existence is part of that proof. And more than that, our faith itself is rooted in the eternal truth that the great battle between love and violence has already been won.